Now, turning to Penelo, I think that, once again, to appreciate this character, we need to consider the game as an ensemble cast, representative of a collective good, rather than a set of characters with intricate dramas to contend with, such as we saw play out in games like Final Fantasy VII, wherein every member of the party has an axe to grind against Shinra. Rather than having some deep-seated trauma to work out and resolve, Penelo is actually entirely averse to adventure, revenge, or stepping out of line at the beginning of the game. The death of her parents leave her in fear of Arcadian oppression, so rather than being the classic gung-ho girl child, such as Yuffie in 7 or Selphie from 8, or Eiko in 9, Penelo is a much more risk-averse and measured member of the party, and her entire reason for going along in the first place is to try and impose this common sense and cautious approach on her gung-ho friend Van. So Penelo's quite interesting because she tends to avoid the conventional trappings of a young female Final Fantasy lead. She's not particularly held up as a love interest or a mischievous girl child or a femme fatale, but rather she's a much more moralising and maternal figure that has some decisive interactions with Van and later Larsa that contribute to the game's humanising of the politics and war that we find ourselves in. And this is important because by not being out for revenge or redemption, or for any sort of noble personal agenda, Penelo is able to gauge things beyond political, personal, or ideological boundaries, and comfortably, is able to sit with Larsa, a supposed enemy, which is an important part of the game, that helps elaborate on the perceptions of Arcadia and House Solidor, because Larsa, of course, feels that he's striving to help people, and it immediately humanises elements of these supposed foes and begins to isolate Vayne as a clearly rogue and despotic leader. So it's a classic Matsuno narrative device that, much like Tactics before it, doesn't divide characters into clearly defined categories of good and bad, but offers shades of grey to everything, which, despite Final Fantasy XII changing hands with writers and directors late on, still shine through at intervals, thanks to characters such as Penelo and Larsa kind of coming together with these dialogues. Now, as we've noted, Penelo is somewhat divorced from the macro politics of Final Fantasy XII, and more cynical fans would argue she's less relevant to the plot, even than Van. But for my part, I think Penelo is perfectly placed because she's never been given undue exaggeration as a central character, but nor has she ever proved completely irrelevant, as the aforementioned micro-story arc with Larsa plays to her character's strengths and contributes to the game story in a small but quite significant way. It's not out of character for Penelo, of all the party members, to emote with Larsa in such positive terms, and I don't think she's actively detrimental to the game by featuring so marginally either. Indeed, part of the fun of Final Fantasy is having a motley group of characters that join forces for some broad, collective reason, and while many in the past have criticised characters like Penelo, Eiko, or Red 13, for being irrelevant, I think they're actually part of the personality and fun that these fellowship quests are supposed to be about.